You are listening to the Global CTE Podcast with your host, Sylvester Chisom.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Global CTE Podcast, where it is our desire to wrap a blanket of goodwill around the career tech education community. I'm Sylvester Chisom, your host, and today we are in for a special treat. As you know, we interview the best, the brightest, the movers, the shakers, the people who are really making a great impact on instruction and learning in the career tech education space. Today's no different. I have Dr. Sandra Adams with me. Now, let me tell you about Dr. Adams. She will become the Vice President of Administration with the ACTE Board of Directors. She's the let me cut that up. Okay. Now, let me tell you about Dr. Adams. She will be the incoming Vice President for Administration with the ACTE Board of Directors. Sandra currently serves as a CTE administrator with a large urban district in Indiana. Her passion for active learning and high-quality instruction led her to author 4 books on CTE instruction and meaningful teacher collaboration, including her top-selling But I'm Not a Reading Teacher. Sandra has worked with numerous school districts across the U.S. and is a regular contributor for ACTE's Techniques magazine. She has provided multiple presentations from state, regional, and national ACTE conferences. Most recently, she is sharing her keynote address, Possibility Thinking with the 5 Ps of WBL, how to embed WBL into any CTE program to promote student performance. We really have a rock star here today. Dr. Adams, thank you for being here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of the show. Happy to be here, Sylvester.
Awesome. I really was looking forward to this conversation with you. Your experience, your depth of knowledge, you touch so many aspects of ACTE. Like, let's go back to what's the beginning? What's your origin story? How did you get here?
Okay, so for me, I am sometimes surprised how passionate and involved in CTE I am when you think about my origin story. And so I always knew that I wanted to be in education. I was a high school teacher for 14 years, and I was rather an academic elitist. To be honest, I taught a lot of the advanced placement classes, and that was where my heart was. And I always, as a teacher, I always felt like professional learning when it came to our staff could have been better. And so when I left the classroom, I wanted to have my own professional learning company. And I did that for about 2 years. Well, I fell into the good fortune of a CTE director asking me to come in and do some work with his administrative team and staff. And I think it was only about a month of doing work with them when I realized that I never, when I was in the classroom, really understood what happens in career and tech ed. And I developed this incredible interest, and I learned as much as I could we had 23 programs, so there was plenty to learn. And anyway, a position opened up to be an instructional coach. So then I coached in all of the CTE areas, and I saw the work-based learning, I saw the labs, but really what I saw that ignited me the most was I saw how a group of students come together as a true cohort that I had never really witnessed in traditional school. And as soon as I saw that, I realized this is where the heart of the change we all talk about. Like, we all know that 21st century learning should be different. And I just saw this is it. This is what you start with, is these cohorts of kids who are going into level playing fields for the first time in their, academic worlds. And so anyway, I decided that I was going to get my administrative license, and I realized I might as well go full bore and get the doctorate, because it was only another year of classes, and once you're in, you're in. So so I ended up doing that, and now I am an administrator, and I just love it. Yeah.
That's so awesome. I think I think we find the most success when we find something we're passionate about and just continue to go deeper down that rabbit hole. And I know what I really was excited about talking with you. I feel like on your journey, you have not kept the information to yourself. You decided to write books and share your learning through your career journey. So talk to me more about like the connection between your books and your career.
I will. So when I first ventured out into professional learning, it was back in remember the Race to the Top days?
Mm-hmm.
And I was traveling around Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, helping teachers understand strategic thinking through remember depth of knowledge, Norman Webb, and all that research.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really kind of given the task of helping people teach strategically, complex thinking. And in my journeys to a lot of the schools, what I realized was I was hearing the same comment over and over. Teachers would say to me after my sessions, there should be a book about this. And I said, finally, you know what, there should be. And the reason that strategic thinking is so hard to reach is because people want an easy fix. You know, it's human nature, that path of least resistance. We all look for it. But with complex thinking, it requires somebody who is versed in lesson design, who sees the whole perspective of the classroom and, you know, all that, 120 variables that a teacher has to pay attention to at the same time, and still focus on thinking. So my first book was really an answer to helping people understand strategic thinking. And it was interesting because I love metaphors. I think that it helps everyone, with even adult learners, when you can really wrap it around something concrete. And it was a scuba diver in the Bahamas, who ended up being the perfect metaphor for that first book. And so just to learn about the blue hole diving, it's worth reading that one. Even if you're not looking for strategic thinking.
Tell me the metaphor. How's it lined up to the first book?
So have you ever heard of a blue hole, Sylvester?
No.
Catching off guard. Okay. So a blue hole looks like a pond. It's just this beautiful, deep, deep blue. And in the Bahamas, they're even more beautiful because everything is. And the thing about blue holes, there's even one in Ohio. They're fed by a spring thousands of feet below surface. And when you first jump in, it's just like any body of water. But down below the surface, there's a level of water that is anoxic, which means there's no oxygen, which means everything below that level has never been tapped by microorganisms, so nothing gets destroyed. Right. So if you're a diver, it becomes like the ultimate challenge. And when you dive, but getting there is really tricky, is what I learned. And so with teachers, I thought it was very similar. Getting to strategic thinking is also very difficult. And so, you know, if you go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying, so you're talking, I'm with you now. You're talking about like the Great Blue Hole in Belize or something like that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
all right. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm with you. Yes. Okay.
So the reason that people want to dive that is not necessarily for the beauty factor. It's that everything that's on the surface has been perfectly preserved because there's no microorganisms. And so they can make these discoveries. And so, for instance, in the Bahamas, they were able to bring up a tortoise shell that had a shark bite out of it. And they were able to bring up some remnants of the shark. And they brought together teams of archaeologists, biologists, and some marine mammal life experts. And what they were able to do is piece together the story. And so when you think about the classroom, it's the same thing. We need to design so that kids can work individually and then bring those students together to collaborate and do some reflective thinking around a task that makes them piece things together. And so it was great.
No, I love that. And I love that you also brought up like the depth of knowledge stuff. Like, do you feel like that's really important in terms of when we're doing curriculum design, like in terms of lessons, making sure we're trying to move to the analytical and critical thinking and creating those higher levels?
I recently read a book, the Global Achievement Gap, excuse me.
Okay.
And that book was really interesting to me because it talks about some of the survival skills that kids need in the future. And it resonated with what I had found to be true with strategic thinking and that whole need for going deeper with knowledge. In that, if you think about where you and I are in our lives, well, you do podcasts, so this will really resonate with you. Adapting and being an agile learner are huge in today's world of survival career skills. And so you and I will work for weeks on something, a project, and then find ourselves like having to pitch it and moving into a completely different direction. And we don't have time to sit and dwell on it. But when you think about the learning experiences we design for students, really just through the lens of being adaptable and agile, it's not very frequently that we challenge kids in the middle of a project and say, okay, now the client has come in, they've had a shift in their workforce demands, or they've pulled this new research, and now everything that you've just worked on doesn't matter. We're going in this direction. And so, just keeping it as critical thinking and real life as possible, I feel like is a good help to these students.
That's so true. I think personally, like that was probably like my biggest takeaway from the pandemic is that you can no longer, like I continue to tell myself this, you cannot stay loyal to old ways that are no longer serving you, right? You have to as you receive new information, as the environment changes, you have to change and you have to adapt. And I think that's like, it's happening so fast now, that is so important for all of us. If those who desire to find success now and in the future, you have that adaptability and agile thinking is so critical now. But I do find it interesting that in education is one of the slower changing industries. Like, we don't like it. You're like, hey, we just figured this thing out. Like, now you're saying change it into something else. For a teacher who's in the classroom, who's listening to this, what are some best practices you think on incorporating what you just said into their lessons?
One of the truths that I believe is that literacy, as we traditionally have defined it in terms of reading and writing, is what most people go to. If I was going to offer any piece of advice for making your classrooms come alive, I would try to think about the 4 components of language: speaking, writing, reading, and listening, and honing in on how you can get more productive talk environments in your classroom. And the one piece that I go back to a lot is, and I use this in my workshops a lot, Sylvester, is when you talk about an average 4-year-old child, the number of questions they say a 4-year-old will ask is around 300 a day. Now, if you step into the junior high school classroom, you see that the average questions asked, especially if you take out, like, can I go to the bathroom? Those, or can I go to my locker? The average number of questions a junior asks is around 2. And that, to me, is systematic of the biggest problem we have in education. And that is, when they come to us by the time they're juniors in high school, we have to remember these students have been conditioned their entire academic careers to answer questions. And, when the teacher asks a question, students know what to do with that. But when you reframe it and you give kids the problem and say, okay, so let's start with the questions. What are all the questions we need to have around this? And that's what you and I do in our daily work that we don't necessarily teach to students. And I think if you really focus on those 4 language components and consider what are the environments I'm creating so that students do want to ask questions. And I always stop and look at a classroom's physical space before I do anything. Because if it's in columns and rows, the first question is, when is the last time you or I had a really good conversation with the back of someone's head? It doesn't happen, So the physical environmental competency is a really big step forward. Just taking columns and rows and making a U
right
transforms your classroom. And then if you think about what it is that you're giving students task-wise, is it interesting? Would you want to talk about it? Is it open for exploration? And a lot of times that focus in CTE specifically, I have found is a huge plus if you think about your career field literacy. One time I sat in on, we had intern students with a local software company, and I went to sit in on a meeting just to see them in action.
Okay.
And I happened to walk into a cloud architect meeting. And this was about 6 or 7 years ago. And I had no idea what a cloud architect, I don't think I even knew that we had cloud architects in the career world. And so listening to them say things like containerization, I remember, and the different concepts, that literacy is completely different than welding literacy, than CNA literacy, and, really thinking about how health students need an entire literacy around being empathetic. Whereas construction workers, empathy is important, but it's not at the top of their literacy components just for that career field. So I like to frame literacy. I said that in a very roundabout way, but that's how I like to frame it.
Well, I think that's a very valuable way of thinking. And also I had someone on, Pat Brown. He's the CTE
I know
director.
Pat.
You know Pat? Okay, yeah. Good
Iowa?
guy.
Yeah.
No, actually, no. This Pat Brown is in St. Louis, Missouri, Fort Zumwalt School District. He's the CTE director.
That's
there.
it. Yeah, I do know
Okay.
him.
Okay,
I had the wrong state.
and he was saying that he really believes, like what you're saying with literacy, is like, how do we align the literacy that is required for the particular industry, right? Like, so a welding student should probably be learning more about like the manuals and things that they're going to have to read from a welding career standpoint, or making those things more career specific,
right,
to be in alignment. I thought that was very, very interesting. I want to move the conversation to PLC in CTE, a book that you wrote, and I'm super excited about it. And we're talking about creating thriving cultures of achievement in CTE, right? So, like, talk to me about break that down for me. PLC and CTE, like, what motivated you to write that book?
So that book really came out of two different motivations for me. One is in CTE, everyone who's involved knows that a lot of times you'll have somebody who may have been a plumber for 18 years and now suddenly is a classroom instructor and a plumber. Or, and somebody was an RN for 12 years and now they're CNA instructor. And as somebody who has spent their whole life developing educational practices in that pedagogical lens, it's important to realize that it's easy in CTE to talk about your career focus because that is where the passion lies. And one of the reasons that DeFore's work around PLCs, professional learning communities, became so well received in education is because it's the heart of collaborating and developing your efficacy as a teacher and knowing that what you're doing is making an impact and driving students forward. In CTE, when you first enter into CTE from your career practice, there's really not a lot of time for you to develop your own sense of efficacy or that sense that your instructional practices are strong and you're doing what you should be doing to advance students. And the reason I thought was professional learning communities exist because you take 12 English teachers who are teaching the same freshman classes and you put them together so that they can dive deeper into how are you instructing, what's your assessment. Well, in CTE, across the country in every school, you have, I am the only welding teacher. I am the only CNA teacher. So it's really difficult to take that powerful concept and make it happen in schools. But so I wrote PLC and CTE because there is a way, and we were able to pull it off successfully at a school that I was working with. And it was about taking the shift off of the content and putting the shift only on instruction. And so, like the rest of the world in education, I was so thankful when John Hattie released Visible Learning and did the effect size work for all of us. And I took apart those top teacher-driven moves that can advance students, and we focused our conversations around that effect size. And a really good example, Sylvester, is every teacher knows frequent formative checks for understanding is a powerful approach, and you should be constantly seeing if your students understand the content that you just presented to them. Can they organize it conceptually?
Right.
So how are teachers doing that? And if you took together an EMT teacher, an early childhood teacher, a welding teacher, and an automotive teacher, and put them in a professional learning community, they can put their content differences aside and just talk about the practice of instruction. And we have found that even in conversations around technical vocabulary, taking the content out is powerful. And it really does develop teachers into a collaborative group who talk just about how effective is this type of instruction.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So
a lot.
We're taking a pause on content and putting the emphasis and focus on the instruction. So what are you seeing as some of the best practices around instruction that work for CTE? Like when we're removing the content, like here's a framework, structure it this way. I'm curious your thoughts.
One of the biggest advances that I was a part of was I had some automotive instructor friends who were really amazing in the lab, but in the classroom, very traditional. Here's my PowerPoint. The number one approach for any teacher in high school is to lecture and then follow with Q&A, or do the direct instruction with question answer sessions afterwards. And maybe I have some slides. So we were talking deeply about, although that's effective, is there something more effective? And I found in my conversations with this particular set of teachers that one of the reasons they didn't move past that form of instruction was because their belief that kids wouldn't be able to figure out the content on their own. So we called the strategy we ended up coming up with Figure It Out. And it's actually in a techniques, blog that we had written for pages online. And what we ended up doing was creating in the classroom, again, we started with the physical space. So we created pods for 3 students, and there's a reason for the 3. That way everybody that was in the group had a role. So you had a diagrammer, a researcher, and a questioner. And the task was given, this particular one was around different ignition systems. So if I get the content wrong, remember, I'm not an automotive instructor. I just pretend to be one. So they have, so they grouped the students into teams of 3, and we gave them an iPad, we gave them the textbook, we gave them butcher paper, and then in the center of the room, we brought in different automotive parts like springs and coils and demonstration parts, so that the students could access the parts when they read it, to come over and see it and feel it and make it concrete in their world. And we told them that they had 45 minutes to work together on the specific process that they were trying to explain how it worked. And then once they thought as a group they understood it, then one of them would diagram it on the paper. And then at the end of 45 minutes, each group would stand up and say, this is how this ignition system works. And then the instructor could say to the students as they were going through, he could pause them right in real time and say, okay, does that make sense? Or how would that valve open? Again, I can't go too deep in my example, but it was amazing to watch the students, because you have to go into it knowing that they're not going to be able to teach it like you, the instructor, but that doesn't matter. What matters is they've taken that dive into the blue hole and they're below that anoxic level and they're making the discoveries for themselves. And the real learning happens when they're explaining it, because for you and I, every learner, when you make a mistake, when your brain says, oh, that was wrong, you get double the neuron firing as you do when it's just a learning situation. So for the teacher to point out that, okay, I can understand why you thought that might be the next step in the process, but it's not, and here's why, then students are more apt to remember that. So it makes the formative check for understanding so much more powerful. And the other key thing is I'm a firm believer in de-emphasizing grades. And one of my mantras in education is, if you focus on the process instead of the result, you end up improving both. Mm-hmm. And the teacher said that the work, when we got done that first time, students wrote an essay about the different ignition systems. And I do remember he said across the board, best essays he'd ever gotten. And then the next time we did it, we added graphic organizers for kids to organize their thinking better in that 45 minutes. But it was great. Just a really great lesson in how to use productive talk and all those literacy strategies.
Yeah, that's really deep. And I love how you pushed from the traditional framework of PowerPoint presentation, lecture, then questions, but shifted the learning focus where it was really student centered. I love that, and a lot of learning by doing, which I really think is the best way. Now, you just mentioned something, taking the focus off of grades. I've had a lot of people on the podcast, and this subject of competency-based grading keeps coming up. And I've had a couple guests who their schools, they've completely gotten rid of grades and it's all just competency-based. So I'm curious with your thoughts on instruction, CTE, PLC, and being on the board. Like, what are your thoughts around competency-based grading in CTE?
Well, that is a really good question and extremely valid for where we're moving in the future. And I'm not saying to take grades completely off the table, but I do believe that you need to be reflective. And something really interesting happened in the world of formative instruction about 8 years ago, because formative checks for understanding, by their very definition, is ungraded. And the minute you grade them, you can't call them formative, but people across the country do. They call them like, these are your formative assessments. And it's just really wrong in every sense of the word, because it's no longer formative, because formative means I'm just forming my learning. I'm doing this without a grade. And it's okay if you want to grade every single thing, but don't call it formative, because the minute it has a grade, it's no longer formative. And I firmly believe, and some of this goes back to when I was a traditional high school teacher. I had a student come in one day at the ACT results had just come in, and she called herself a 19. She said, Mrs. Adams, I'm a 19. And I said, Sydney, we're never a number. Stop doing that. And we talked about it endlessly. And it was a real wake-up call to me when we give kids numbers on their work or on their quality, how they wear that sometimes. Yes. And it can really contribute to a sense of learned helplessness rather than I'm just trying to learn. And so for me, I believe in doing the summative assessments, and I believe that it's crucial for students to know where they are. But the competency-based grading on rubrics is such a great way to teach kids that your performance is criterion referenced. And, I think for all of us, we've all had that day. I remember being in college and getting a C- on a paper that I poured my heart into, and the instructor didn't say, anything to help me understand why I got a C- on my paper. And those, that's really frustrating as a learner. But if you have a rubric in front of you, and I also believe in rubrics as simple as like 1, 2, 3 or 0, 1, 2. If you're talking about skill development, don't convolute it with like you have 17 out of 32 points here. It's, you either have it, you're almost there, or you're there. And those kind of rubrics and those kind of skills can really build a learner up, I feel.
Let's stay there for a minute. So you feel, as it relates to CTE and putting attention on skills, if we're trying to verify learning in a rubric, you're thinking 0, 1, 2 is probably the best framework for that?
Yeah, I've worked with teachers who have adhered to that system, and it is very cut and dry, and it doesn't overcomplicate things. It's very simple, especially in skill development, because right. It's just clearer for the learner that if you're not a 2 and you're a 1, here are the reasons and here are the steps that you're missing in this, in learning this process or developing this skill.
So 0, you don't have the skill or have not made an attempt yet. Or 1 is maybe you tried it, but you're not proficient.
Yes. And then
the 2 is, yes, you have
nailed it.
Right. You have the skill. Okay.
And I even saw that used with work ethic skills. And in my book, but I'm not a reading teacher, I do a lot with the work ethic rubric. And so even something like preparedness, for instance, a 0 is you showed up today completely unprepared. A 1 could be you were prepared, but you were scrambling at the last minute to pull it all together. And the 2 is you had all your materials, you were ready to go. And, and a lot of times we don't distinguish between the 1 and the 2. Like we saw them scrambling and we know that they hustled at the last minute, but we don't necessarily point that out to them. And I always think, if somebody would have done that for me in high school and said, Sandy, I saw you out in the hall before class scrambling to get this done, I think I would have been a much better learner early on.
Yeah, what do you think that does when you tell someone that? Like when you, like if someone had shared that with you, like, Sandra, I saw you in the hall, like, yeah, you got it done, but you were scrambling. Do you think that pushes you to be more prepared? I'm curious.
I just think, I have 3 daughters, and I know that in the course of their lives, anytime an instructor gave them honest, hey, I saw this in you and I think you could be better, I do think that, students take that to heart when somebody that they respect gives them that kind of feedback.
Yeah, that's good.
Like, you could be better if.
That's good. Okay, so I also want to say congratulations on this new appointment as your upcoming role as the Vice President for Administration with the ACTE Board of Directors. Congrats to you. I'm just curious, what are your plans for that role? Like, how do you hope to impact CTE from that position? I'm curious.
One of my biggest agenda items, if I could push forward, is I am a firm believer in the power of work-based learning. And, we hear so much today about career readiness and getting kids into internships. And I was privileged about 8 years ago to kick that off in this region for high school students. And I have never in my life experienced anything as fulfilling as opening doors to companies and helping these students prove their worth in high school than I have with internships. And what I'm working on right now is just really, and this goes to the keynote that I deliver, possibility thinking, because what I've noticed is that what we need to do is really redefine teacher. And, it's like one of those questions you never ask is, how do you define teacher? And so I'm pretty sure Google says, or Webster says, somebody who delivers content or knowledge. Well, that obviously is like we're way past that in today's world. And to me, redefining teacher is thinking about somebody who is an efficacy builder for students. So we show these students, you do have the power to make something different. And I think it's important to distinguish between, we're not talking about self-esteem, we're talking about efficacy and the ability to see that you can make something happen. And I would like to use CTE as a platform to demonstrate that building efficacy in kids and connecting them to adults outside of the classroom are two of the most powerful things we can do to reshape education. And so I have, my own little pulpit that I preach from on work-based learning, but I think it's really, if you look at, we have instruction that hits most kids. And
Okay.
then we have, on both sides of that, we have those kids who need more, and in terms of, I need more instruction, I need to get this differently, I'm really struggling. And we have kids on the other side of that who are also, I need more, but they're saying, I got the content, I didn't struggle with it, and I need more experience. I think work-based learning is the antidote to both of those problems. I think getting kids with adults who can expand their views and getting them into different environments sometimes can just shift a kid in a completely different direction.
I love it. I'm in 100% agreement with you on that. I just recently had an episode with the founder of CAPS, Corey Moan, and their whole thing is getting students out of the classroom, connecting them with industry professionals, that sort of thing. I'm curious for you. So we have a lot of CTE directors and teachers that listen to the pod. What advice, best practice, give them something tangible on some strategies to connect their students with real world professionals to get them out the classroom. Any thoughts on best practices? How do you start that? How do you get that going?
Well, in my designs, one of the things that I would like people to consider is thinking about your advisory board partners on a different level. And what if you reached out during the summer to your advisory board members or trusted business partners and said, I would like to start this school year with an email introducing you to one of my students so that they could get a taste of how we all connect, and give them, like, this is your person when you're working on a project. So it'd be like, Sandra, I would like you to introduce you to Sylvester. Sylvester is going to be your mentor this year as a business partner in our area. He has done this, this, and this. And then Sandra is a year 2 culinary arts student who wants to go into hospitality management, and will be reaching out to you this year to interview you, to do some questions. I have worked with lots of different partners, and I have never had someone say no to coming in and working with students. And even if it's just a Zoom, when students are doing presentations or skill-based work, business partners can jump in on those Zooms, watch, and give kids the questions to make them think deeply about it. And you can also reach out to business partners and say, can you give me a project that your company worked on so that I could see if my students could come up with the same solution or if they had a different solution. And so I think about, if you're working in a CTE staff, really thinking about year 1 down to, the successful completion of year 1 to year 2, and can you make a range of experiences? Because work-based learning, I feel like people think it's a one and done. And some people think it's like a series of one and dones. But really, work-based learning is a mindset. It is the advantage that we have in CTE to have these advisory boards, and people are willing to make a contribution to your students. We just have to figure out really good ways of asking them. And so for me, I always use this process, Sylvester. I always say, you raise a student's awareness, you expose them to a new environment, you give them a connection, then they have an insight, and then they can see, like, there are more possibilities than I thought. And so that's like my little magic formula.
I get you. I love it. I love it. You gave so many gems right there. That is
I'm
powerful,
glad.
and I know that's going to help someone who's listening. That was really good. I want to move the conversation. We're talking. It's in alignment, but Catapult, Kevin Fleming, talk to me
Yeah.
about your work with with this professional development team, and what do you have upcoming? What are you working on with Kevin and Catapult?
So Kevin's dream of the catapult is really just transforming professional learning. In fact, when I first met him, I'd already read about catapult, and I approached him and said, I just have to say congratulations because you nailed it on what is wrong with professional learning. And he has this idea with marketing and retention and career readiness, work-based learning practices, that a staff grows best when everyone hears the same message and when everyone sits around one message and asks those deep questions and they really push each other. So he brings the leaders to the schools rather than the schools to the leaders. And it is a great way to approach it. So I challenged him to think about Catapult for effective instruction because that is my biggest passion area. And he is in the works on that and really does such a great job across the board with advancing career and tech ed. And I know, for instance, restructuring advisory boards, I know he is looking at experts in that particular area. And like what we just talked about with work-based learning, and just thinking about the quality of instruction that is, not necessarily specific to CTE, but then also there are points like advisory boards that are very CTE specific. And so his name for the company is aptly chosen. It is to catapult and just elevate people to that next level. So my work really mirrors his, I believe, in terms of taking what are the most important pieces that would advance someone and giving them that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's transformative, and the intentionality behind it and bringing everyone together. I love the format and structure of it. I'm curious when you brought up the first point. What do you think is wrong with the way we do PD in CTE? I'm curious.
Well, I don't think it's CTE. I think professional development across the board. I know when I was in that short little stint where I was doing the professional development life, people would constantly come up to me at the beginning of a session and say, I'm here to train the trainer. Well, that's great. But in the course of a 6-hour or 7-hour PD, I don't know if you can develop the expertise to go back and train. And I would try to give people resources. And I did a lot of digital blogs and the vlogs for ACTE on their website on instructional strategies. But it's so much more helpful when you all are hearing the same message, especially the disconnect between administrators and teachers. I feel as if a lot of times it's because they're going to different professional development sessions and they're focused on different concepts. And then it's hard to come back and have that whole coherent vision as a team.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that I feel like the Catapult PD does get right. So anyone who's interested in that, make sure you go and check that out. Catapult PD with Kevin Fleming. Anyway, this has been a great conversation, Sandra. I feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours. You're so smart. You have so many different areas of expertise that you have gone deep on. I want to push you into the future now. Okay, it's my last question for you. What is your vision for the future of CTE?
So I adhere confidently to any future vision has to be connected tightly to the economy, because I believe that at the core, everything we do is somehow economically driven. And right now, with all of the boomer retirements and the shortage of labor, I feel like pushing students into those work-based learning models has never been more the time than it is right now. There's never been a better time for that. And I do see in the vision of my vision of the future is that America really starts to adopt that Swiss model for how we are looking at students in terms of, if I'm a sophomore and I'm disconnected with school and I want more, looking at in Wisconsin, the Boeing company has the Swiss model in place, and you can go into YouTube and see some of the videos where these students, even as young as sophomores, are doing a little bit of their day with the companies. And I'm not saying that, I mean, I have 3 degrees. I value the degrees. And so I think that when I say that, it's just for one section of students who might be hungry for that. And really also still celebrating the degrees, but seeing post-secondary as the word that we use, not college, but post-secondary, and valuing that when you are working with any 100 group of seniors, that it's not a third college, a third military, and a third work. It's so different than that. Some people may want a 2-year degree. Some people may need an apprenticeship. Some people may need a 4-year degree. Some people may need just a license and some support making a connection. So I think in the future, what I would like to see is just a greater respect for the role of work-based learning, getting companies way more involved with what's happening in classrooms, breaking those silos down, and honoring post-secondary is different for everyone.
Wow, very well said. And I love how you started with the economy. I'm a firm believer as well that education should reflect the job needs that are in the industry, that are current now and anticipated in the future. And that's how we should be preparing our students so that we maintain competitiveness in this global marketplace. Absolutely. Sandra, wow, like you shared so many great insights, so many gems. We definitely have to have a follow-up to this conversation, but I know someone who's listening right now, it's like, how do we get Dr. Adams in here for a PD session or a workshop or a keynote or get some of these books, PLC and CTE? Tell them where should they go if they want to connect with you?
My LinkedIn would be the best. Yeah, thank you. This was great. Absolutely. It was so fun.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this conversation, share it with a friend, and like and subscribe to the podcast. And until the next episode, remember, you don't have to be great to get started, but you have to get started to be great.
Thank you for listening to the Global CTE Podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe to be the first to know about future episodes.